It is a piece of pale ivory linen with various slightly darker markings. Is it really the image of Jesus Christ moments after his crucifixion, as many believe? Are the stains really his blood? Well-publicized carbon dating tests say no. Rather, that this 14-foot length of cloth is a very clever medieval forgery. But recent information has raised serious doubts about the accuracy of the carbon dating. Scientists are again pressing their attention to the old question: is this an image of the crucified Jesus? Since the 1400s, the shroud has been taken out of its silver box many times, draped over balconies for royal weddings, and stared at in wonder by countless pilgrims. The shroud first appeared in Europe in 1355. It was well known during the worst years of the Black Death, when huge crowds stood in line to see it, when Gutenberg perfected the printing press, and when Columbus discovered America. In an age short on scientific tools, in which forgeries were commonplace, the question of the shroud's authenticity could not really be resolved. The public generally assumed the shroud was authentic, but the debate between science and religion was just getting underway. In 1898, the church permitted examination of the cloth by the impersonal eye of a rather new invention, the camera. No one could have expected that the photograph Segundo Pia took that day would change forever the way people saw the shroud. For as the photographer's glass plate emerged from the developing solution, he saw a face, a distinct, clear face, unlike anything ever seen before on the shroud. He understood at once that the shadowy image on the cloth had been a negative, and that he was now looking at a positive. He held in his hands an image that would launch a century of scientific investigation. A 100 years after that first photograph was taken, the city of Turin prepares for another public display of the cloth. In that time, it has become the most studied artifact in human history. A new high-tech home is being prepared for the shroud. A hermetically sealed case of aluminum and glass from which the air is pumped out and the inert gas argon pumped in. When the shroud is placed in here, it will never be rolled up or casually handled again. All this activity may seem surprising if the carbon dating tests are correct, that the shroud is a fake. Is it blind faith, or is there reason to doubt the scientific findings? The shroud is again the center of controversy. At an unmarked side entrance, restricted access enforced by guards, unseen by the public and documented only by a single camera, a Swiss textile expert carefully stitches it to a new backing cloth, inch by inch. For the curator of the shroud, there is no question about who it is this cloth once covered.
This image represents a man who died from the torture of crucifixion.
On the Shroud of Turin, there are three types of markings. The most obvious marks are scorches from a fire that almost destroyed the shroud in the Middle Ages. Then there is the anatomically correct image of a man, front view and back. And third, what appear to be bloodstains. The bloodstains match biblical descriptions about the torture and crucifixion of Jesus: the beating, the crown of thorns, the spear wound. But is the blood really blood? And how did the image get onto the cloth in the first place? The persistent mystery surrounding these questions has challenged scientists for generations. Students at this college in Glendale, California, get a special glimpse into the ongoing debate about the shroud. Their professor, Angelo Montante, uses the shroud as a teaching tool.
This is one of the most amazing cultural artifacts that we find in the history of Western civilization. Clues can be drawn out of it that gives us a perspective on the past.
The Bible does not give us details dealing with the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth. But let me call your attention to this spot right here where there was bloodshed. If classical paintings were correct, he should have been nailed through the palm, but he wasn't. He was nailed through the wrist. And there has to be a reason for that. And we know what the reason is because of some research done by a French physician.
Years ago, a French surgeon experimenting with cadavers was able to determine that the palm cannot maintain the weight of a human being. It has to be through the mesocarpal region of the wrist.
Something else is important in this regard. When you nail a person in that area, you press on the median nerve. And when you press on that median nerve, the thumb goes in. And if you'll notice, you do not see thumbs on the figure at all. That's a very accurate kind of thing. How could a forger have possibly known that? Here we have another enhanced image of the shroud. This darkened matter represents blood. Hair, more blood on the arms, and then the whole torso is bleeding.
On the side of the torso, near the fifth rib, is an unusual exudation of blood. It matches the shape of the Roman lancia, which was in use at the time of the crucifixion.
There is a lot of blood on the shroud, so much so that it makes you wonder at the cruelty of the Romans, that they inflicted such pain on this individual.
Cruelty shown on the shroud far exceeds most artistic versions of Christ's Passion. Why would a forger have displayed so much more than people expected to see? Short streaks of blood on the back and legs of the man on the shroud baffled researchers for years, until it was noticed that they exactly matched the peculiar shape of the first-century whip, the flagrum.
I'm holding in my hand a replica of a Roman instrument of torture. It's called the flagrum. And at the end of each thong, you find these dumbbells. Notice that there is a space between the two dumbbells.
Even modern medicine would probably not have been able to prevent this death. We can determine the severity of the wounds of the man on the shroud because of the anatomical accuracy of the image. An image so accurate, it can be read by a modern physician.
This is a quarter-size negative of a picture of the shroud, and it appears to be a middle-aged male. If we assume that blood is going to appear white, there are other things that will appear white as well. But if we
As a
assume that
specialist,
blood
Dr.
is going to
Zalut
appear
is used to
white,
examining X-rays of acute
then
trauma
you can see
victims.
that there's areas of bleeding diffused about the scalp, both in the front and in the back. There's areas in the chest, again in the front and in the back, that look as if there's been bleeding. You can see that there's been an injury to the left wrist. I can't see the right wrist because the left hand covers the right wrist, but there appears to be an area of injury to the left wrist with blood on both forearms. The posterior portion of both legs and the buttocks are covered with blood as well. In both ankles, there appears to have been some bleeding as well. It's impossible to say what the cause of death was, although there's multiple areas of injury, any one of which could have been fatal.
The specific wounds are consistent with only one cause of death: crucifixion. In the late 1970s, a group of scientists pressured the church to let them examine the shroud with the latest technology. An agreement was finally reached, and the Shroud of Turin research project, STURP, was on its way to Italy.
STURP was put together primarily with the purpose of examining the shroud to determine how the image was formed. But we had the big problem of never being able to see the thing we were to examine until we got there. It was like an expedition into an unknown part of the jungle. We brought with us a host of technologies, virtually every type of imaging that we had available to us to determine how the image was formed. I thought that I was going to be able to walk into the room, see the shroud unveiled, walk up to it, look closely, see the brush strokes, and go home.
Vern Miller was another of the scientists involved. He also started off with a skeptical attitude.
The first time I heard about the Shroud of Turin was from Barry Schwartz, which I thought was a fairy tale of some type. But STURP's objective was to find the mechanism that caused the image to appear on a piece of linen cloth, and not to authenticate the cloth as the burial wrapping of Christ. So relieved of that responsibility, we could look at it in a much more objective way.
I didn't know what the shroud was at the time. I'd never heard of it to my knowledge.
STURP member Don Lynn took time off from his regular job as director of JPL's digital imaging program for NASA.
At the time, we were working on the Viking program, which was a soft lander on Mars.
We basically had one day to set up the equipment, get it unpacked, set up, and calibrated. And that night, we were supposed to get the shroud around midnight. And of course, about 11 o'clock, a little early, very unusual, the shroud was brought down the hallway into the room. One of the first experiments that was done on the shroud was to separate the cloth from its backing cloth in a small area, about 4 inches. That allowed us the first look at the backside or the underside of the Shroud of Turin in 400 years, and this image is the precise moment that they took their first peek at the back of the shroud. Then Professor Rigi of the Italian team inserted an endoscopic camera between the two cloths. When I saw that focusing light underneath the number 3 bloodstain, I turned off the room lights, he turned on the focusing light, and we saw for the first time that the bloodstains had actually soaked into the cloth the way blood would, and the image did not.
Right away, a significant discovery. When viewed from the front, both the image and the blood are seen clearly. But when light is shown through the back of the shroud, the blood is visible, but the image is not.
That was something we didn't know until that moment, which meant the image could not be a painting, or we would have a density of paint on the shroud that would show in a transmitted light photograph.
We were all anxious to find if the blood was real or not. When I first viewed the shroud during those tests, The blood did not look real to me. The blood looked quite red and fresh, other than something that was supposedly 2,000 years old. To determine if this was real blood, we took samples on a sticky back tape and then examined it in a laboratory much later. It was not until several months later that we determined that this was real blood. Okay, in the next slide, we show the actual blood on the weave of the cloth.
Is this the blood of Jesus? Is it the blood of another person who happened to have been crucified by the Romans? Is it the blood of an innocent man taken to create an extraordinary hoax?
One of the theories of image formation on the shroud was that it might be a scorch because the color is something like the scorched color of an ironing board cover. In normal light, both scorch and image look the same. Since all scorches fluoresce under ultraviolet light, we imaged the shroud using UV photography. We did not see body image. We got wonderful images of all the scorches on the shroud, but the body image didn't show at all, proving that the body image could not be a scorch.
As to what might have caused the image, the scientists ruled out possibility after possibility.
Microanalysis of the threads that were brought back determined that the color change of the threads was due to a chemical change, dehydrated oxidation. But we do not know what caused that chemical change.
The stains on the cloth are remarkably subtle and complex. One fiber will be discolored, while an adjacent one is not. Yet each fiber is only 1/10 the diameter of a human hair. And in some places, the image only penetrates to 1/500th of an inch. There is no known way of replicating such markings on a cloth. Most experts are now convinced that the image was not